My name is Ethan Caldwell, and for nearly 6 years I thought I had the perfect home. It sat at the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, surrounded by old oak trees and backed by a long wooden privacy fence that separated my yard from the property next door. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. The problem started when my new neighbor, an HOA board member everyone simply called Karen, decided that my fence wasn't actually my fence anymore. Every morning, clothes, blankets, bed sheets, and towels appeared hanging across it like some public laundry station. At first it seemed like a small annoyance. Then it became a daily invasion. What shocked me wasn't just the entitlement, it was how confidently she acted like the rules applied to everyone except her. The HOA sent warning letters over flower pots and mailbox paint, yet somehow ignored an entire clothing line stretching across my property. Bro, hearing how far this eventually went genuinely blew my mind. What started as damp towels on a fence quickly turned into neighborhood drama, official complaints, property damage accusations, and one lesson Karen would never forget. And trust me, this was only the beginning. When Karen first moved in next door, I honestly thought she seemed normal enough. She was one of those people who always looked busy, always had somewhere important to be, and somehow managed to mention her position on the HOA board within 5 minutes of meeting someone. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Every neighborhood has people who take community rules a little too seriously. What I didn't realize was that Karen viewed those rules as something she enforced on others, not something she followed herself. The first time I noticed laundry hanging over my fence was on a Saturday morning. I had walked outside with a cup of coffee and immediately spotted several large beach towels draped across the wooden panels facing my yard. At first, I assumed it was temporary. Maybe she had run out of space. Maybe it was a one-time thing. I shrugged it off and went about my weekend. The next day, the towels were back. Then came blankets. Then bed sheets. Then entire loads of laundry. Within 2 weeks, it had become a routine. Every morning I would look outside and find my fence covered in someone else's laundry. Bright-colored sheets fluttered in the wind. Towels hung so low they nearly touched my flower beds. On humid days, water dripped into my yard. On windy days, clothing would blow loose and land on my property. At first I tried being patient. After all, neighbors are supposed to work things out. I walked over, politely explained that the fence belonged to me, and asked if she could stop using it. The response wasn't what I expected. Karen acted as if I was being unreasonable. According to her, the fence sat between both properties, which somehow meant she had every right to use it whenever she wanted. Never mind the fact that property records clearly showed the fence was entirely on my side of the boundary line. I figured a simple misunderstanding would eventually resolve itself. It didn't. Instead, Karen became even more comfortable. Soon she wasn't just hanging laundry on the fence. She was leaning baskets against it. She was attaching clips to the wood. She even tied ropes between sections to create longer drying lines. Every time I removed the ropes, new ones appeared a few days later. Bro, this is exactly how some entitled people operate in real life. They start with something small. Then they slowly expand until their behavior becomes the new normal. The situation became even more frustrating because Karen constantly enforced HOA rules against everyone else. One neighbor received a warning because their garbage can was visible for a few hours after pickup day. Another homeowner was fined over a holiday decoration that stayed up too long. Yet every single day, Karen transformed my fence into a neighborhood laundromat. The double standard drove everyone crazy. Several neighbors quietly complained about her behavior, but nobody wanted a direct conflict with an HOA board member. Karen knew that. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable. Then things got worse. One afternoon I came home from work and discovered several boards on my fence had started bending outward. At first I thought it was weather damage. But after taking a closer look, I noticed heavy blankets had been clipped to the same section repeatedly for weeks. The constant weight and moisture had warped the wood. That was the moment my irritation turned into a genuine problem. Repairing fences isn't cheap. I took photos of the damage and documented everything. Dates, pictures, videos, timestamps. Every piece of laundry. Every rope. Every basket leaning against the fence. I wasn't planning revenge at that point. I simply wanted evidence if the situation continued. And continue it did. Over the next month, Karen's behavior escalated even further. She began hosting backyard gatherings where guests casually used the fence as well. Soon there were multiple families hanging items across it. What had once been an occasional nuisance had transformed into a daily spectacle visible from half the neighborhood. I genuinely couldn't believe what I was watching. Every reasonable attempt to solve the issue had failed. Karen ignored requests, dismissed concerns, and acted like ownership didn't matter. Meanwhile the fence continued deteriorating. But what Karen didn't realize was that while she was busy treating my property like her personal drying rack, I had quietly started preparing something she never saw coming. And when the opportunity finally arrived, the lesson would be far more memorable than any HOA fine she had ever handed out. The turning point arrived at the beginning of summer, right when the weather became perfect for drying laundry outdoors. If Karen had been using the fence excessively before, she practically turned it into a full-time operation now. Every section of wood seemed permanently covered with sheets, blankets, towels, and clothing. Some mornings it looked less like a residential fence and more like a commercial laundry facility. What made the situation even worse was the growing damage. The moisture trapped against the wood accelerated wear on several panels. Metal clips scratched the surface. Heavy blankets pulled sections outward. A fence that had stood perfectly straight for years was starting to show visible stress. I continued documenting everything. Photos. Videos. Dates. Times. Weather conditions. At this point, I had accumulated months of evidence. The funny thing is that Karen never seemed concerned. In fact, she appeared more confident than ever. She probably assumed that because nobody had successfully challenged her before, nobody ever would. That's exactly how entitlement grows. People become convinced they're immune to consequences. Then came the HOA's annual neighborhood inspection. And this part was unbelievable. A few days after inspectors walked through the community, I opened my mailbox and found a violation notice addressed to me. According to the letter, my fence was showing signs of deterioration and required repairs within 30 days. I actually laughed when I read it. The same fence Karen had been using every single day. The same fence she had helped damage. The same fence I had repeatedly asked her to stop using. Now I was being warned about its condition. Bro, hearing that just blew my mind. Most people would have immediately argued with the HOA. Some would have paid for repairs and moved on. Others might have started a neighborhood feud. I chose something different. Instead of reacting emotionally, I carefully reviewed every HOA guideline, every property rule, and every maintenance requirement. For several evenings, I sat at my kitchen table reading documents most residents never bothered opening. And that's when I discovered something interesting. Very interesting. Buried deep within the HOA regulations was a section governing exterior structures, attachments, temporary installations, and property modifications. Most homeowners probably never noticed it because it rarely applied to everyday life. But the more I read, the more an idea began forming. Karen had spent months using HOA authority as a shield. What she didn't realize was that the same rulebook she loved enforcing was about to become the biggest problem she'd ever face. By the time I finished reading those documents, I wasn't angry anymore. I was excited. Because for the first time since this whole mess began, I could finally see a path forward. And Karen was walking straight into it without the slightest clue. For the next 2 weeks, I didn't say a word to Karen. That alone probably confused her. After months of asking her to stop using my fence, I suddenly became completely silent. No complaints. No reminders. No requests. From her perspective, it probably looked like I had finally given up. In reality, I was doing the exact opposite. I spent that time gathering every piece of documentation I had collected. Hundreds of photos showed laundry hanging from the fence. Videos captured blankets secured with clips and ropes. Time-stamped images documented the gradual damage to the wood. I organized everything into neat folders and cross-referenced it with the HOA regulations I had discovered. 6. The key rule was surprisingly simple. According to HOA guidelines, homeowners were prohibited from attaching temporary structures, lines, cables, supports, or visual drying systems to neighboring property without written approval. Violations could result in fines, mandatory removal orders, and reimbursement for damages. The rule existed primarily to prevent people from installing unsightly clotheslines that affected neighboring lots. Ironically, Karen had been violating it almost every single day. And because she was an HOA board member, her actions carried an even greater expectation of compliance. Bro, when I realized that detail, I knew exactly where this was heading. Instead of confronting her directly, I submitted a formal complaint package to the HOA Compliance Committee. Not Karen's committee. A separate committee responsible for reviewing evidence and enforcement recommendations. The package was massive. Photographs. Videos. Property surveys. Fence repair estimates. Maintenance reports. Copies of previous requests asking her to stop. And most importantly, evidence showing repeated violations of the HOA's own regulations. Then I waited. About 10 days later, things started getting interesting. Several committee members visited the neighborhood to inspect the situation personally. They reviewed the fence, examined the documentation, and compared everything against the HOA rules. Karen apparently assumed it was a routine matter. That assumption didn't last long. The committee quickly discovered that nearly every claim in my complaint was supported by evidence. They also learned something even more damaging. Karen had participated in discussions involving fence maintenance notices while failing to disclose her own role in creating the problem. That detail changed everything. Suddenly this wasn't just a laundry dispute. It became a credibility issue. It became an ethics issue. It became a leadership issue. 7. Within weeks, the HOA issued an official determination. Karen was ordered to immediately stop using the fence. She was required to remove every attachment, rope, clip, and support connected to it. The committee also concluded that her actions had contributed directly to the documented damage. Then came the part nobody expected. The repair costs. Because the evidence clearly demonstrated ongoing misuse, Karen became responsible for a substantial portion of the fence restoration expenses. The same fence she had treated like a free clothesline for months now generated a bill with her name attached to it. I genuinely couldn't believe how quickly the tables turned. For months, she had acted as though ownership didn't matter. Now official documents were reminding her exactly whose property it was. The fence was repaired, reinforced, and restored to its original condition. More importantly, not a single towel, blanket, or bedsheet ever appeared on it again. But the biggest consequence wasn't financial. It was reputational. Karen had built her authority on enforcing rules for everyone else. The moment the neighborhood learned she had been caught violating those same rules repeatedly, people started viewing her very differently. And once that reputation cracked, it never fully recovered. Looking back, this story was never really about laundry. It was about entitlement and the belief that rules only apply to other people. Karen spent months treating someone else's property like her own while hiding behind HOA authority. Bro, that's exactly how people create their own downfall. The moment accountability finally arrived, everything unraveled. What amazed me most was how a simple fence became the thing that exposed years of arrogance. In the end, the repair costs weren't the real punishment. The loss of credibility was. And honestly, that's usually the karma that hurts the most. That if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below.